Again, I'm Mike Aller. I'm the Director of Supplier Development for Florida Makes, which is the Florida Manufacturing Extension Partnership. I'm here also with Connor Hilla, who helps support our supplier development and cybersecurity practices. We're very excited to have Mike Semel with Semel Consulting here with us today. We have a great session. Mike is a great subject matter expert on risk management and cybersecurity. He's actually a certified third-party assessor, which is a rare commodity these days. And so look forward to hearing from you, Mike, about your experience so far. And obviously, cybersecurity maturity model certification has been something that's been percolating for a while. But it is something now. There is an interim rule, a proposed rule, which has been going through the comment process. Comments just closed a couple weeks ago, and we are expecting that the final rule will be coming out late this year or early next. Mike will be talking about that, but there is a lot of things that companies need to know to be able to be ready for that when it happens. And we're already hearing from a number of companies that it's starting to pop up in contracts. So looking forward to hearing more, and take it away, Mike.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for joining today. As you can see from the title, it says CMMC Demystified, and I'm going to do my best. But CMMC has resulted in a new language, a new ecosystem. Lots of things have changed over the last couple of years. And as Mike said, we're going through a rulemaking process right now. So there are things that still may change. So to kind of put an asterisk on this, saying this is CMMC as we know it today from the proposed rule. And what I talk about today is subject to change until the final rule comes out and becomes official. So when I talk about demystifying this, this may be new language to you. And if it is, don't worry, don't try to take a lot of notes and try to figure these things out or be looking at terms on your phone or on your computer. Let's focus on this today because the recording is going to be available. And maybe after we go through this the first time, you get a chance to absorb some of the information, go back again and look at the recording, because that may give you a bit more perspective while your mind's jumping around learning their new terms and concepts. Go back through the recording and you may find out that there were things you missed while your mind was running ahead of schedule. So the first thing I want to do is thank Florida Makes for hosting this. This is an important webinar because it's going to help educate you and hopefully answer questions that may prompt some questions. And if you have questions, there's a Q&A box here, and feel free to enter those questions. We'll answer them at the end of the webinar. So I asked you not to take notes, and that's because at the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you a chance to get a free guide that I've written about CMMC that hopefully is going to give you a desktop reference tool you can reach out and use whenever you need to. And things change over time. You may be working on CMMC now, you get another project, now you have to go back to it and you want to look at the terms, or you need to find out some information about the scoring system. It's all going to be in the desktop guide. You'll have a chance at the end, so have your phone ready. There will be a QR code. For those of you that don't like QR codes, there will be a link as well. So first of all, I want to talk about why CMMC even exists. And that's a question that people have asked. Why do we even have this? And, you know, it's a pain and everybody's all worried about it, and it's for good reason. So going back to 2010, there was a presidential order that defined a new category of information called controlled unclassified information, CUI. And within that, remember that we're talking about the entire government. When we look at CUI, there's covered defense information. That's the information, obviously, from the Department of Defense. But other agencies also have CUI. So we're going to focus on this from the defense standpoint. We're going to talk about CUI, but specifically it's the covered defense information. In 2016, there was a new DFARS regulation. DFARS is the term for the contract clauses. So when you sign a contract, Usually there's a page or multiple pages that say the following clauses are incorporated by reference. And then it's a whole bunch of numbers. And the one we care about is 252, 204-7012. And this goes back to 2016 when this was being put in contracts. It required two things. The first thing was that defense contractors were committing with that contract when they signed the contract to implement all 110 controls in a special publication from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and its publication 800-171. And we're up to revision 2, so it's R2 if you really want to get specific. And it also required that if you did have an incident, you had to report it to the Department of Defense within 72 hours of discovering that. And the deadline to implement all 110 controls was the end of 2017. So all defense contractors were supposed to have done this. 81% of defense contracts included the clause, but because the clause was kind of hid, sometimes buried in that long list of clauses incorporated by reference, it got missed. And then there were some people that saw it and frankly just ignored it. So in 2019, the Department of Defense's Inspector General did an audit of defense contractors and found out that most of the things that were being required were not getting done. There were a lot of deficiencies. They also discovered that the DoD and the contracting officers weren't enforcing it. They weren't auditing this. Nobody was paying attention to it. The report also noted the Department of Defense was not doing a good job marking the data and the paperwork in some cases as controlled unclassified information. So this was a pretty scathing report and it couldn't be ignored. It went to Congress. A lot of people, got fired up about it and they came back with CMMC. CMMC is not just an annoying regulation. War is now cyber war. And it's our patriotic duty to protect our war fighters who are on the front lines and supporting them by securing the data. What we do, we always think about it as data, but it really gets down to the people can be affected by this. And this isn't some data breach necessarily where your identity got stolen and somebody's going to do credit monitoring for you for a year. This is where people can get hurt if that data is stolen. So it's a serious thing. What's protected by CMMC? There's two classifications of data that are protected by CMMC. Federal contract information, that's just information about the contract. And there are a lot of contracts that don't have sensitive information tied to them, but the contract information itself, as long as it's not designated for public access, needs to be protected. And then we have controlled unclassified information. So when you look at these two circles, you see that CUI is a subset of FCI. Federal contract information is everything about the contract. Within that, you may have CUI, controlled unclassified information. FCI has to be protected under just general federal acquisition regulations. CUI has to be protected under DFARS, which are the defense contract requirements. So let's take a look at CMMC. And CMMC has changed over the years, and we still have people telling us things, we know about CMMC, and then they'll say something where we realize they're not caught up to the current version. So first of all, CMMC is based on the 110 cybersecurity practices that are defined in that NIST special publication 800-171. There's an accompanying assessment guide, NIST 800-171A for assessment. So it takes those 110 practices, but it breaks them down into 320 assessment objectives. So there are really 320 things you need to do, not 110. All contractors have federal contract information, FCI, the estimate's over 200,000. Many of those also have controlled unclassified information. The estimate's about 80,000. CMMC will allow some self-assessments, and independent assessments, where the company has to get an assessment organization in to independently assess them. We're going to discuss that more in a minute. But one of the key things that's all throughout CMMC is that business leaders, not an IT person necessarily, it doesn't specifically say who, but the executives at the companies that are defense contractors that need to be assessed will have to sign legal attestations that everything that they've provided, all the information they've provided about their cybersecurity is accurate and thorough. And there's a lot of weight that comes with that signature. CMMC, and this is the newer version of CMMC. Since version 2 came out, there have been 3 levels. If you're still thinking there are 5 levels, that was in the original version, but it got changed. Now there are 3 levels. Level 1 is for organizations that only have FCI, federal contract information, and don't have any CUI and don't have that 252, 204, 7012 clause in their contract, which would indicate that they're probably going to deal with the UI. There are 15 controls. Sometimes you might see 17 controls, but what they did in the assessment guide, the latest assessment guide, is they combined 3 of the practices into 1. And now it's 15 controls. And if you're at level 1, you can self-assess. The businesses that have access to or may come in contact with CUI must be at level 2 at a minimum. Those are the 110 controls or practices that have to be implemented. Originally, CMMC said that everybody was going to need to be certified independently. The newer version of CMMC and what's in the final rule there, I'm sorry, the proposed rule that's published in the Federal Register says that there'll be independent assessments and certifications. Some level 2 companies will be able to self-assess. And the Department of Defense has a phase-in period as the capacity builds for assessments. But no matter what, if you are doing an if getting independently assessed and certified, the certification good for 3 years. But it doesn't mean you're done when you get your certification. You still need to maintain current evidence because you can be audited at that time, and your executives are going to have to sign off annually that you're maintaining that level of cybersecurity. Level 3 is a level 2 plus additional requirements. So if you are going to be working with highly sensitive, controlled, unclassified information, we're still not talking about classified. We're talking about CUI. If it's considered sensitive, then the procurement officers that you're working with are going to be telling you that you have to be at level 3. You get a level 2 assessment first, and then the government DIBCAT, which is a part of Department of Defense, will come in and they will assess you for 23 additional items that come from a different publication, which is NIST 100-172. You'll remember at the beginning that CMMC came out with a whole new language and a whole ecosystem. So we have the people and the organizations that are in the new ecosystem. So the Cyber AB is the accreditation body. That's the organization that oversees the training and the certification process. There are registered practitioners and registered practitioners advanced. And as of today, there were 1,472 listed by the Cyber AB. There are RPOs, which are the organizations the RPs work for. So the RP is the individual certification, or it's an accreditation. It's not considered a certification. That's they call it registered. But the companies can sign up and pay fee to become an RPO, registered practitioner organization. There are 311 of those today. Then we have the certified people, CCP, CMMC Certified Professional. This is a higher level certification, and there are 650 of those today. And CCA, which are the assessors themselves, and I'm one, can lead assessments. There are 178 of us. The organizations that employ assessors are C3PAOs, CMMC third-party assessor organizations. There are only 50. And that's because it's a very strict regimen to get certified, and there are government inspections and approvals and things. The number 50 is held for about 3 months now. It's kind of backed up in the process. But what you look at the bottom are companies, and maybe you're on this list, OSCs, organizations seeking certification, but also they use the term OSA, organization seeking assessment. You'll see both if you read the Federal Register and read the rule. 80,000 companies that are going to need level twos. To look at these numbers and realize right now there are only 50 companies that can do assessments, and there are only 178 assessors that can do assessments. So it's going to take a while to get all 80,000 people, or I'm sorry, 80,000 companies certified at level two. The documentation is just scary. When you look at all the different documents, and some refer back to others, and others are brand new, and one at the bottom isn't even available right now. So we have the CMMC proposed rule, which is 234 pages by itself. Then we have NIST 800-171. Remember, that's where the controller defined. And then we have 171A, that's where the assessment protocols defined. And then for each level of CMMC, we have a scoping guide and an assessment guide. And then for those of us that are assessors, there is the Cyber AB's CMMC assessment process. It's known as the CAP. There's a draft version now, right now, based on the previous version of CMMC. That's what we were all trained by. But you can't even get this from the Cyber AB's website. They're in the process of redoing it, and it probably won't be final until the final rule comes out. So it's over 1,000 pages of documentation to really understand the CMMC program. And I can tell you, because it was part of our training, there's a lot of nuanced detail in here and a lot of gotchas if you really don't understand the language. If you remember, I mentioned a scoring system. Department of Defense came up with a scoring system, which is in place now for an interim rule. So if you're a defense contractor now, and you want to qualify for new contracts or renewals, you have to post a score on the SERS, known as SPURS database. And the score is based on this scoring system where they each of the 110 items. So when you look at the left-hand column here, those are the item numbers that are in the guides. So the first one is AC, access control, L2, level 2, dash 3.1.1. That's actually the numbering system out of NIST 800-171. And it says limit system access to authorized users, processes acting on behalf of authorized users or devices. And you can see at the right, that 5-pointer. Well, that's huge. If you don't limit access, then most of the rest of the things down this list can't even start to happen. So that's a 5-pointer. And then you can see as you work down the list, there's some 1-pointers and 3-pointers and things. We're going to bring the scoring system up as we talk about some other things as we move through this. The entire scoring system's in that free guide we're going to give you at the end. One of the things you can do as an organization seeking an assessment is to work with vendor and share the responsibility for some of the things. So the example here is from Microsoft, and this is what we call a shared responsibility matrix. And this says, this is Microsoft with their different services saying if you're using their SaaS, software as a service, which would be like Office 365 or Microsoft 365, that there are some things that you as a customer are completely responsible for, such as your data. That's why you have to back up your data, because Microsoft isn't. That's not our responsibility. As you move down to the very bottom and you see the physical data center security, you can offload that to Microsoft because you don't even know where their data centers are, but you're not responsible for the locks on the door of their data centers and the video surveillance and all those things. That completely shifts to them. So when you have requirements in CMMC that say you have to physically protect the systems that house your data, you can inherit that from Microsoft. So this is something that's really important because if you're working with a managed service provider, or if you are a managed service provider, there are things that the managed service provider is going to do for you that you don't do yourself. You can inherit those practices. If you're using a cloud service, and just about everybody is, again, you don't have to be responsible for something like the physical security in the data center. That's somebody else's problem. Now let's talk about the scoping of a CMMC assessment. And this is a huge issue. It's a huge issue because it affects the cost, it affects the scale of the project, and if you don't get it right, it can get you in some big trouble. So the first thing is that you are the one scopes your assessment. Nobody else does that for you. That's not something that the assessors do. It's not something that the Department of Defense does. It's your business, how things work in your organization. You are the one responsible for scoping your assessment. And then the assessment team that comes in is simply going to assess what's in, you've said is in scope. So if the assessment team, while they're there, discovers that your scoping is wrong, you're going to fail your assessment right away because you didn't include things that you should have, and you may not have things documented that you need to. But the other risk is that, say, the assessment team does come in, doesn't know that the scoping's wrong. They do an assessment, they certify you, and then remember, everything's subject to audit by the federal government. So DIBCAC, which is the Department of Defense's assessment organization, comes in and they assess you and find out you're wrong, or maybe you have an incident that needs to be investigated, and they discover that your scope's wrong. If that's the case, then at that point, you've collected federal money under false pretenses, and you can be sued under the Federal False Claims Act. I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. So let's start out with things that are out of scope of your assessment. And this depends on the size and scale of your business. And we've worked with companies that have had multiple locations, and only one or two locations deal with Department of Defense projects. We've also worked with small companies that everybody does everything and wears multiple hats. And there's no way to really segment off the Department of Defense projects from any of the other ones. So the entire company has to be considered in scope. But if you can physically separate systems, or logically, that means that they may be on a different network than the ones that handle CUI, then you can define out of scope assets. What's in scope? Well, the first one, and there are going to be four different categories here of things that are in scope. The first one's the obvious one, CUI assets. These are the systems, and a system can be a laptop, a desktop, it can be a machine on the shop floor, it can be lots of other things, but we're going to talk about the machines on the shop floor separately. Even though they may have CUI, they're in a different category than these. So CUI assets are those computers and devices that process, access, or transmit or store controlled unclassified information. Process can just mean accessing it. Even if it comes from a cloud or some other location, the fact that it's being accessed is that being processed by that computer. They're literally processors in the computer. Stored means that the CUI is saved on a device or in a cloud, on a thumb drive or some other type of device, could be a mobile device, and then transmitted. So transmitted would be sending it across a network, sending it by email. There are different ways to transmit CUI. When we look at the CUI data, it must be protected, it must be encrypted, but not just by standard encryption. The federal government has a certification program called FIPS, and FIPS 140-2 validated encryption is required for CUI data. And this has been one of the more difficult things for businesses to deal with. And in many cases, it's the one thing that may cause them to fail or to delay their certification. CUI data in the cloud, which is any service you get to through the internet, must be in a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud service. If you're not familiar with that, that's a question to ask your cloud service, or if you're working through an MSP, ask your MSP to validate this. And this is where commercial services are not good enough to protect CUI. So we have clients that have been using Microsoft's commercial 365, which is their email, their contacts, and their calendars. And they've had to move to Microsoft GCC, which is Microsoft's government cloud. And you can't just buy it. You have to apply for it. You pay X for it. It doesn't really look or feel any different, but it's in different data centers and it's got a different level of security. So these are things that you need to be paying attention to. There's another category. So those were the CUI assets. There are contractor risk managed assets. And these are the official terms out of CMMC. I'm not just making up categories. So these are systems that are intended to access CUI, but they're capable of it. And they're on the network, and you have to be able to segment those systems or block them, keep them from being able to access the CUI that may be on other systems in the network. And they don't have to be on a separate network. They don't have to be in another location. They could be sitting like right near a CUI machine. As long as they can't get to CUI, they're considered a contractor risk managed asset. One of the big categories that's causing a lot of consternation are these security protection assets. And this is where managed service providers come into the picture, managed security service providers, and the companies that they work with, or the companies, if you have your own internal IT department, that you may work with to provide security tools through the cloud. So security protection assets are assets that provide security functions or capabilities to the contractors. That's the defense contractors assessment scope, irrespective of whether or not these assets process, store, or transmit CUI. These are tools that are protecting the systems that process, store, or transmit CUI. And when you look at this table, which came right out of the proposed rule, it says people, technology, and facilities. So we always tend to think about all this stuff as technology, but no, they're saying that the people and also the locations that are where this information or these systems can be housed. So consultants who provide cybersecurity services, managed service provider personnel who implement system maintenance. So you don't need to be a high-level security engineer to be covered under this. If you're simply doing patching and updating and endpoint protection and the basics that an MSP does, you're covered as a security protection asset. Then under the technology, cloud-based security solutions, SIM solutions. These are solutions that take the logs, the activity logs, and aggregate them and analyze them. And then facilities, co-located data centers, security operations centers, and OSA, organization seeking assessment, office buildings. All of these categories are in scope of a CMMC assessment. This is the one you're probably wondering about. So this is what we call specialized assets. These are assets that can process, store, or transmit CUI, but are unable to be fully secured. So the Department of Defense recognizes that a lot of the machinery and the shop floor tools that you use may be old. You may have kept them alive for 20 years. They're still bending metal or cutting metal or turning, if it's a lathe that's spinning around and it's got a useful life left in it, but you bought it so long ago, it doesn't have modern security features. They're not telling you to get rid of those things. So we look at the categories under specialized assets. Internet of Things, IoT devices. Those could be surveillance cameras, heating and air conditioning systems, things like that. Industrial Internet of Things devices, operational technology. That's kind of the picture that I have here. Government furnished equipment, restricted information systems, and test equipment. The Department of Defense recognizes that these things cannot be secured like a modern computer can, and they're not telling you to replace them. Here's what they find specifically: PLC, CNC devices, machine controllers, fabricators, assemblers, and machining, hardware and software that directly controls industrial equipment. So these are the things that you probably have connected to a network but can't be secured. One of the things you should do is have those on a separate segment So because they can't be secured, and we've been in places where they've told us they know that the tech that was working on a machine that came in from the factory to work on the machine actually infected the machine, but the machine was on a separate network segment, so it couldn't affect other machines in the company. So that's a way to secure these things. What do you have to do with them? Well, document, document, and document. You have to document them in your inventory. You have to document them in your system security plan. That's a Department of Defense document, a standard document that you use now for the interim rule. It's going to stay through CMMC. And you have to show where they are on the network diagram, but they are not assessed. So as an assessor, if we see that machine, we're going to look at your network diagram and expect to see it there. We're going to expect to see that it's listed in your system security plan. But once we see those things, we're not going to go in and assess the security. And that's because the DoD has exempted it. So one of the things that you can do under CMMC is narrow the scope of your assessment. And again, this is only if your scope and scale of your company allow this. Basically, you can create a segment of your network, or we're seeing some vendors now offering solutions in the cloud where you can use their solution and not build your own network segment. But basically, if you can segment off where your CUI is in your company, you can say that the rest of the company is out of scope and the only things that are in scope are these systems. It means that they really have to be walled off, in some cases physically, certainly, but from an electronic standpoint, they can't even be on the same network as anything else if you're going to create a true enclave. This is something that, everybody loves to look at kind of as a loophole. We can just select what we're going to do, but as you literally walk through your process and you see where CUI comes in and where a designer may be, you creating a drawing and then that drawing goes down to the manufacturing floor, or somebody has to create the code go into a 3D printer or something like that. It's very difficult as you move through your process to always do this, but this is an option and you should at least look into it because it could save you a lot of money and a lot of effort. We talked about MSPs and the security tool vendors, and this is information that has been published in the Federal Register. It's very clear if you understand CMMC language, but it's confusing if you don't. I'm going to put it in simple English, and that is that if a CMMC Level 2 defense contractor outsources all or part of its cybersecurity or network management to an IT managed service provider, MSP, or the security services, MSSPs, then the MSP or the MSSP will need to get a certification at the same level as their client, or their client will fail. And the challenge here is that means that the MSP will need to be assessed before the client gets assessed, or else the client's going to fail. None of these things are currently built into the CMMC process. And if you're an organization seeking certification and this survives the end of the final rule, you're going to have to work with your MSP. The problem is you can't just change MSPs instantly if you have to. So you should be talking to your MSPs now, asking if they intend to pass a CMMC Level 2 assessment, assuming you do, and maybe even ask for a letter of intent, at least get some sort of guarantee that they're looking at this, they're willing to do it. Because if the answer is no, we're not going to do that, it's too difficult or it's too expensive, then you are going to have to switch MSPs and there won't be any choice in this. If you're an MSP, this is something they need to be looking at because there will be MSPs who decide not to do it. And maybe you can take business from them. The cloud-based security tools that MSPs use and MSSPs use have to come from a FedRAMP moderate or equivalent cloud service. Most of the vendor that we've talked to in this space, and I work in this space and I go to the conferences and I know a lot of the company executives, they're not ready for this, and they're probably not going to be able to get ready and move into a FedRAMP environment in the time it's going to take to match or to meet the CMMC requirements. This is one of the things that a lot of people have commented about during the comment period for CMMC, the proposed rule, and hopefully the tools may be moved to specialized assets or something else. That's really going to be the deal breaker, because if you're an MSP and you say, yeah, I'm willing to get my level 2 certification, but your vendors that you have contracts with, the people that are in your security stack, they don't want to do it, then you're going to be left holding the back. So this is a big deal if you're working with an MSP or if you are one. So now let's talk about the assessment process itself. There are 4 phases to an assessment. Plan and prepare the assessment is phase 1. You would think that. Phase 2 is conduct the assessment. You're still only halfway there. Phase 3 is report recommended assessment results. This is the assessor organization reporting these things. And then close out POAMs. And if you're not familiar with that term, I'm going to explain it in just a couple of minutes. Phase 4 is close out POAMs and close out the assessment. So preparing for the assessment. And notice stack of binders here. This is a document-heavy process. First of all, remember I said you have to define your scope. Then you complete a system security plan, which is a standard template from the Department of Defense that aligns with those 110 practices in NIST 800-171. But remember, there are 320 assessment objectives in the assessment guide. So you need documentation validating all 320 assessment objectives and being able to prove that they've been met. You have to validate your vendors meet the requirements. So again, if you're working with an MSP or you're working with a security tool vendor, you may want to, if you're an organization seeking an assessment, you may want to have a staff member certified in CMMC, because if you're going to manage it within an organization, the more training you have on this and the more you're aligned with assessors, the easier it's going to be to get through your assessment and able to communicate with them if you have questions. And consider an independent advisor in a mock assessment to ensure you are ready. If you get the assessment team in and you fail, they're leaving. And then you have to start the process again. So this is something where if you do, it's just like a practice test. If you're going to study for any sort of a serious test, you're going to go through practice tests. That's really what I'm saying here, is it's a good investment to make sure you're going to pass the first time. So how do you find an assessor organization? So you see the Cyber AB's logo here in the middle. They have a website, and it's the cyberab.org .org website. So you go to their website, and in the upper right corner, you see the red arrow in the upper right corner there, there's a thing called Marketplace. So when you go to the Marketplace, they have different categories. So they have all the individual certification. You want to validate that I'm a CCA, you can go in and click and put my name in, and you'll see me. But you can also find your certified third-party assessor organizations listed here. Then you get to pick who you want to work for. So this is a completely free market. You can pick anybody you want to. They can charge anything they want to. So you need to work with a company that you feel comfortable with and that meets your price or your financial requirements. You're going to have to discuss your scope and scale. And again, it's going to be different if you've got 10 locations across the country, or if you've been able to narrow this down to one location in a small enclave. Everybody's different. Validate that you are ready. That's a big part of this. And you're going to work with the C3PAO, the Certified Third Party Assessor Organization, and they're going to interview you to make sure you have all the parts and pieces. And if you don't, then they're going to tell you, come back later. And then when you come back later and you have everything in place, that's when you can agree on the scope and the cost. So what do you do in your planning? And I'm looking at you as the organization that needs to get certified. First of all, assign your internal assessment team leader or leaders, depending on the size and scale of your organization. Once you get into the assessment, once the C3PAO, the third-party assessor organization, has registered you for everything, they're going to give you access to a federal website, and you're going to put your data up there. It doesn't go into the C3PAO's network ever. And then your artifacts or your evidence get loaded, and that's where the assessor organization is going to go and look at them. Ensure all resources, and I use the term resources because it's people and places and things will be available for the assessment. You don't want the assessment team to show up and if somebody, on vacation that's a critical person, and it's going to delay the assessment or even maybe get to the point of having it canceled. And then you've got to work out logistics for an on-site visit. Now, in some cases, CMMC can be done virtually, but that's only for organizations that are all working virtually with people from home, like a consulting firm might. But I don't know of any manufacturer that can't get out of or that can get out of an on-site visit, because if you're a manufacturer, you obviously have a physical facility that's going to need to be assessed. Who's on the team? At least 3 people, and usually more. There's a lead assessor, and then there are assessment team members, and then a person that you may never see and come in contact with is that in the background, there's a quality specialist who's going to review everything, and they're the ones that actually upload the final results into a federal website. So the teams are truly teams. And again, based on your scope and scale, it may be one person that just shows up for the formality of an on-site visit, or it may be an entire team because your scope and scale warrant that. What's the methodology? And this is something that I've seen a lot of misunderstanding about. And particularly people that work in IT think that an assessment's going to be somebody showing up and you're going to walk around and demonstrate that you're doing the right things. That's not what CMMC is. In fact, that's not what we deal with in most regulated industries, because we work with clients in the healthcare industry that have to comply with HIPAA, and the financial services industry with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act and the FTC safeguards rule. And the technical people tend to think, well, an assessment just means I have to show somebody that I'm doing it. No. In this case, it's really document heavy and paperwork or screenshots, evidence heavy. So examine, interview, and test. Those are the 3 methodologies. Everything needs to be examined. In other words, you have to have documentation for everything, policies, procedures, and evidence. And the assessor is going to review those things. But the documentation must be in final form. You can fail assessment if you hand an assessor or upload a document that said draft. You want to make sure that these are final versions, if they're policies, that they've been signed, not just written words on a page, but they've been signed. And maybe evidence from a meeting, like meeting minutes, that show that a board of directors or an executive group have approved those policies. Those are critical things. That's what most of the assessment is. Most of the time that we spend on an assessment will be examining things. Then we have interviews, and interviews are really just to validate what we've seen in documentation. And we're going to talk to the people that are responsible for implementing those things, and also some of the users, just to make sure that they really do have to do those things. So take something like multi-factor authentication, and we'll look for documentation that shows the type of multi-factor authentication and what systems it's on, and different things that would relate to that particular topic. And then we're going to talk to the technical staff that manages the networks or manages the systems to ask about the multi-factor authentication, and then maybe want to talk to a user and say, what happens when you log in? They say, well, I put my login, my username, my password, then I have to pull my phone out and I've got this authenticator app on my phone or something like that. That's an interview process. And then randomly, very seldom, not the main part of the assessment at all, demonstrations to validate the expected behavior. So if I was walking through a facility and I was interviewing somebody, I would say, can we walk to a machine? And maybe we're on the shop floor. We say, let's put that one over there. I see that person's using a computer next to their in their work area. So please have them log out, and then let's watch them log back in. And that would be a test. And what we're looking for is the expected behavior, expected based on the documentation that we've seen and the interviews that we've done. But again, this is, if I were to say assign percentages, probably something like 60% examine, 30% interview, 10% test, very little testing. And the only testing that will be done is still after we've seen the documentation that explains what we should expect as behavior. Most of the document reviews will be done off-site. Of course, on-site visit is more of a physical security walk-around to see things and validate that the physical security requirements that are required to protect data. And that means things like systems that access CUI should be locked offices, and they shouldn't be in places where people can't get to them. And if there's CUI, for example, on something like a thumb drive that has to be carried from an office to a machine, that it's properly marked and that it's encrypted. That's what an on-site visit is for, and also to do some interviews and to see some demonstrations. It's not the bulk of the assessment. And people ask me how, all the time, how long does assessment take? It's like asking how much rope does it take to tie a horse to a fence? It depends on the size of the horse, it depends on the size of your organization, the scale of your organization, how many facilities do you have, how many employees do you have, and so forth, the complexity of your systems. So it's all going to vary. When we do an assessment, there are only 3 choices for each of those practices. Met means that all the control objectives, all 320 control objectives, but in this case, we're looking at an individual practice. So let's say there are 5 control objectives. We're going to make sure that all 5 of those control objectives have been done and proven. And if even one of them out of 5 has not been, that whole practice is unmet. Not met, obviously, means that where more of those control objections has not been proven. And then there's not applicable. And that's not a choice you get to make. That is where, for example, if we're talking about security on a wireless network and you don't have one, or security for remote access and you don't allow any remote access, then those are not applicable. And the assessment team is going to want some validation that that's correct and that you don't have those things and that you're not using them. But met, not met, and not applicable. There's no partial credit for anything. Which brings us to POAMs. So POAMs, plans of action and milestones. And this means that it's something that is not completed during the term of the assessment. So this is something that's a to-do list when you look at a POAM. But it only applies to the practices with a score of 1, with one exception, and that's the requirement of the system security plan. In order to qualify for a POAM, you must have a score of 88 out of 110. That's 80% on your assessment. And if you don't reach that score, you fail, even though you have items that you still need to do that qualify for a POAM. If you're not at 88 out of 110, you're going to fail the assessment. If you do qualify, then you have 180 days from the time the assessment ends to close out those POAMs. And what that means is you have to address each and every one of those items, all of them, and then you have to re-engage with another certified third-party assessor organization. It could be the same one you worked with, it could be a different one, to get your POAMs assessed. And then if there's anything not met on a POAM assessment, you fail. Remember, I said the Department of Defense can do random audits. So this requires you to maintain your assessment documentation. If you're the organization that's being assessed, you have to maintain your own documentation. The Cyber AB doesn't do it. The Certified Third-Party Assessor Organization doesn't do it. The Department of Defense doesn't do it. And you have to hold on to it for 6 years. You have to maintain current documentation, because if you assessed a year ago and then they call you for an audit, they're not going to look at your information from a year ago. They want to see current versions of all that to make sure you're continually meeting these requirements. And obviously, through your contracts, you're agreeing to cooperate with the DoD assessment team. Failure of an audit may result in a federal False Claims Act lawsuit. You'll remember I talked about the attestations. These are your executives, senior leadership. At the end of a successful assessment, the senior leadership will sign an attestation that all the information provided was accurate and thorough. And then every year, even though, remember I said the assessments are good or the certifications are good for 3 years, if you're self-assessing, you self-assess every year. But if you're dependently assessed, your certification's good for 3 years, but annually your executives have to attest. And this is also subject to the False Claims Act. So I've mentioned the False Claims Act a bunch of times. It's a big deal. It goes back to the Civil War. Its nickname is the Lincoln Law. And it was when people were trying to sell uniforms and tents to the Union Army, and they were showing the demo version that were really sewn well and the tents didn't leak and all that. And you can guess the rest. When they delivered them, they were shoddy and the tents leaked and the uniforms fell apart. So people were defrauding the government. And they came up with this law, and this law has been in effect since the 1860s. And now it's morphed into if you knowingly misrepresent your cybersecurity, you are defrauding the federal government. The Department of Justice, not the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice has a civil division that enforces the False Claims Act. And they have a specific task force that works on this. You can see the headlines at the right to see that there's activity here. And what you have to pay back are 3 times what was paid to you by the federal government, plus additional financial penalties. And whistleblowers are rewarded up to 30% of what you pay as a penalty. So when you look at the bottom headline about Aerojet Rocketdyne agrees to pay $9 million to resolve their False Claims Act allegations, the federal government collected the $9 million. The whistleblower, the former employee that turned in, got $2.61 million. That's a pretty good payday. There's a lot of incentive, and the federal government actually solicits whistleblowers. They encourage whistleblowers, and they'll pay whistleblowers. So people that will turn you in are probably not people from the outside of your organization. They're people on the inside of your organization if they believe you're not doing the right things. What's the cost of an assessment? That's again, a huge question that people ask. The table on the right came right out of the Federal Register, came right out of the proposed rule. And this is for what they call small businesses. Now, their definition of a smaller business is under 500 employees. So look at the right-hand column. It's in yellow, which is a certification assessment by an independent assessor. And the bottom line for a small company says $104,670. So I rounded it up to 105,000 here on the slide. But what I've highlighted in yellow, that's just for the assessment. That does not include the cost of implementing any of those requirements. And the reason for that is the Department of Defense said, hey, you were supposed to have done that back in 2017. So when they costed the assessments, and you look at this, that is what they expect, what the federal government says an assessment likely cost a smaller business. But of course, this is going to vary based on the scope and scale. And remember, it's a free market. So if there are only 50 assessors, 50 assessor organizations, and there are 80,000 companies, if you're raising your hand saying, hey, our prime contractor says we need to have a level 2 assessment, like in the next 3 months or something like that, we've got to get it done. You're going to have to negotiate the price because, again, it's a free market and they can charge you anything you're willing to pay. Remember, I said there were capacity challenges. So here, look at the bottom of the right column where it says level 2 certification, where it says certification, those are the independent assessments. You'll see that over the 7-year period, they're expecting 76,598 companies to be assessed. And when you look at the top box here, for in year 1, they're only saying 517 of those companies are going to do this. But what this doesn't consider is the line I put at the bottom. Prime contractors are telling their subcontractors, if you're going to work with us, you need to get an independent level 2 assessment. Because if a contract does come out that require that, we're not going to wait for you. We need people in our bullpen right now or in our dugout ready to play the game that are level 2 independently assessed. Because if that's what the contract requires that we want to bid on, we need to make sure we can. So these numbers I think are real. If you look at the bottom and you see the 4,000 plus 76,000, that's where we come up with this 80,000 companies that are likely going to need level two assessments. That we look at this, I think it's going to be a higher number. It may be weighted the opposite, where 14,994 are going to ask for it in year one because prime contractors are telling them to it. So these are things that are just theories, and we're not sure exactly what's going to happen when the final rule comes out. But here's a strong message to you. On average, it takes 12 to 18 months to prepare for a CMMC level two assessment, and CMMC is expected to be in contracts in 2025. Do the math, and you're going to see it's a challenge right now. So when it comes to CMMC, who should you listen to? Well, there are a lot of people out there talking about CMMC and saying that they know about it, and some of them have no formal training. So when you look at the different people that can get trained and either accredited or certified in this, we have registered practitioners, and that's about 6 to 8 hours of self-paced video training. Does not include access to the CMMC assessment process guide. That's not in the training. It's referred to. And there's an online test. They do a commercial background check. They sign a code of professional conduct. They're about 1,500. And remember, I said you can go find them on the marketplace. So this is something where you can either find somebody on the marketplace, or if they come to you and want to guide you on CMMC, then you want to validate that they've got formal training. And this is one way to do it. Look for that registered practitioner badge. The next level up is CMMC certified or certified CMMC professional. And here's one of the challenges. I thought when I was an RP, registered practitioner, I thought I knew a lot about CMMC until I took this course. And this was a 4-day class, instructor led. And then there was a lot of study to do because I had a 3.5 hour test in a secure facility to be able to pass the accreditation. The Department of Defense, or they're doing it right now, actually, background check. I had to sign the Code of Professional Conduct. There are about 650 CCPs. So we know more, frankly, than the RPs do. And if you're looking for that kind of guidance, or if you're looking to get somebody in your company certified, you may want to go to the CCP level and not the RP level. Then we have the assessors themselves. 4 days of training, a lot of study, another 3.5 hour test. And I'll tell you, I think it was the hardest test I've ever taken. Again, the Department of Defense background check, signed the Code of Ethics, and right now there are 178 of us in the world. So in order to find somebody to work with, I would not just listen to anybody who's talking about CMMC without checking to make sure that they've got formal training. So if you go to that Cyber AB marketplace where I told you earlier to look for your certified third-party assessment organization, now you can click on the RP, RPA, CCP, or CCA boxes, and you're going to find the people that are accredited, registered practitioners, or are certified CMMC professionals or CMMC assessors. And that's where you're going to be able to validate that they got the training. And one of the warnings here is there are a lot of people talking about CMMC. I was at a recent conference where a speaker had on their slide that they were a CCP. And I wanted to get that speaker's contact information. So I went out to where else? The Cyber AB marketplace, and their name's not listed. So there is some fraud going on in this industry. And the way to hopefully avoid it, or the best way you can avoid it, is go to the Cyber AB's marketplace and pick someone from there. We talked a lot about CMMC, but you have more than CMMC to deal with. So you have CMMC coming. Currently, you have the DFARS interim rule where you have to do a self-assessment and post a score on the SPURS database. If you're a public company, you also have to comply with Securities and Exchange Commission requirements for public companies. Here in Florida, we have the Florida Information Protection Act, FIPA, and that protects personally identifiable information. Now, we've been talking about CUI and things like that, which is really production information, but don't forget, you've got a workforce and you're part of it. Your company has your social security number that's protected under the Florida Information Protection Act. So when our company works with a client, we look at everything because we don't want to just focus on CMMC and say, okay, you're fine, and then have your employee data breached. We think that all of your data needs to be protected. If you take credit cards, and I had someone say to me, well, manufacturers don't take credit cards. And I said, well, the ones I know do because they have parts departments and they'll sell, people knobs and pieces depending on what the product is, replacement parts, and oftentimes those are paid for by credit cards. The maybe the big purchase isn't if you're building, ships and tanks and fighter jets, but you may have small parts where you accept payment by credit cards and you have to comply with PCI DSS. We're seeing a ton of contracts between companies. And this is a lot of times, if you're in an IT department, if you're an MSP and you're asked to help fill out the cybersecurity questionnaire for a customer, a lot of times that's in a contract. And we've seen these contracts signed and filed away and never shown to the IT department or the MSP. So those are also compliance requirements because compliance is anything someone else makes you do. And finally, at the bottom, cyber insurance. If you have cyber insurance policy, there are requirements tied to that. So all of these things stack up. Look at the stack here. You just did CMMC. Look at all the things that aren't being handled. So we take holistic view of compliance and look at everything, because if you're only doing one part of it at the top or the bottom or in the middle, you're leaving yourself unprotected at some level. So I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. So first of all, again, thanks for joining us today. I've been in IT for over 40 years, and I've been the chief information officer for a hospital and for a K-12 school district. And I've been a managed service provider, and now for the last 12 years, been a consultant. And we don't sell any IT products and services. We just do advisory services, and we do assessments and things like that. I do a lot of speaking and writing. So if you're an MSP, you may see me at some of your industry gatherings. I've got a lot of certifications and also certified not just in cybersecurity and compliance, but also in business continuity planning and cyber resilience. So you do business continuity plans sometimes as part of compliance projects and other times just a separate business continuity plan, because we're seeing customers of our clients demanding to see their business continuity plan and making sure that it's been tested. So we do that. We also work with companies, manufacturing companies that are family businesses. And the owners want to make sure that the business is going to survive to the next generation or next generation. One told me recently that he wants his company to survive for the next 50 to 100 years. And we're doing a business continuity plan for him because it's very detailed, and all the different aspects go way beyond cybersecurity. And I've done a ton of compliance projects over the years. So this is the only advertising you're going to get. And then I'm going to get to your action steps. And remember, I said, have your phone ready, and I'm going to give you a chance to get our CMMC desktop reference guide. So we do cybersecurity compliance, business continuity planning. We don't do like hourly work or just come in and do a risk assessment or something like that. We scope the projects out. Remember, I said it takes 12 to 18 months to get ready for CMMC. Those are real numbers. And for people that had a 1-year contract with us when we started in CMMC, they've now renewed it like twice in some cases. So we will work out a scope of work. Again, we're not selling any IT products and services. Here's our contact information, and you'll have access to this through the recording and the slides. So what action steps should you take from today? They're really just 3. Number 1, don't wait. We had someone just yesterday or the day before say, I'm going to wait for like 6 months before I start on my CMMC journey. It's taken 12 to 18 months. Seriously, even with companies that they're prepared and have good staffs and have a plan, it can take 12 to 18 months because systems have to change. You may need to bring vendors in, you may have to switch vendors in some cases. It takes time. So start now. Bring in an independent guide. And the reason I'm saying that is CMMC is new. It's its own language. You have to have someone help you navigate through it. And as part of that, the last step is get pre-assessed. I would never walk into a CMMC assessment cold without knowing that I passed an independent assessment from a consultant beforehand and fixed whatever problems were found. Because if you fail, you start again. And there's a financial impact to that, and there could even be a career impact to that if you have to go and tell your boss that you failed. So here's the last slide. QR code is safe. There's a link below it you can type in. And this guide is not brief. And the reason it's not brief is that there's a lot to cover. We've got the entire scoring system, and we talk about what's met, not applicable. We talk about all the different players and the acronyms and what they mean. So this is a free gift to you for your time and attention today. And at this point, Mike, if we want to leave the slide, what questions do we have? Hopefully people aren't shocked, but what can I do to help anyone out there?
Thank you, Mike. I have not seen any questions come through either chat or Q&A, but if you want to take time, to do that either through the Q&A tab or the chat tab, happy to do that. We'll give people a couple minutes to that. Or if you want to, we have enough of a group. If you want to just raise your hand, we can also do it that way. But if there are any specific questions that folks have, happy to allow those to. There is a question actually that just came up. Thanks very much, Ted. Is the level 1 self-assessment process straightforward enough to start on our own? Is the question.
It really depends on you. And here's why I'm going to answer it that way. When first of all, there's no part of this that says you have to involve anyone else. But remember, even level 1 assessments are subject to audit by the federal government. So if you're not familiar, if you're an IT person, and I've been an IT person, I've had many of them work for me, and a lot of times what they do, they'll say is good enough. But when it comes to passing an independent assessment, they don't have the documentation, proof, the evidence to validate what they're doing. Now, level 1 does say you don't have to have all that evidence, all the physical evidence and things, because you're self-assessing and because it's only FCI. But it's something where you should try it. And if you want to engage with someone, get somebody from the outside to look at those requirements. And some of the things that we've seen that are missed, and again, this depends on the size and scope and the tools that your company use. We've gone in and looked at network diagrams or software inventories, and they have all the software listed that's used on the individual computers and that are used, in the building. And we'll ask a question like, are you working with a payroll service or do you do your own internal payroll? Oh, no, we're using, you can fill in the blank, ADP, Paychecks. There are a lot of other companies that do that. And they're not listed on the software inventory and things are forgot. So remember, even if you're doing level 1 assessment, you want it to be thorough and accurate. Remember, there were 17 or 15, depending on what you read. Go through that. And if you've got questions about what the words mean, then you may want to bring in a guide.
Great. I do not see any other questions that have come in at this time. I know, there's a lot of interest in this topic, and especially a lot of things that have been happening recently with the rollout of the new proposed regulation for CMMC. I guess the best thing to say is please watch this space. Please continue to keep an eye on it. If we at Florida Makes can be of any support, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach out to us at info@floridamakes.com or directly to myself or Connor, who were on the invite for this event that was sent out, or we can also get you linked up with Mike Semel and a number of other folks who are available to help you if you need some help in navigating this journey. It's in our collective interest to make sure that we're keeping our key information safe and secure. And as you know, cybersecurity is constantly evolving and constantly updating, and there's always things to keep up with this. So it's just another part of living in our modern society, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I really appreciate everyone taking the time today. If we can ever be of further support, please don't hesitate to reach out at any time, and look forward. We will be having some additional programming and some additional resources on this as the CMMC is rolling out, and other initiatives as well in cybersecurity. So thank you very much again, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Mike, especially for your time and your expertise. Really a great resource and a great opportunity to highlight this, and thank you again. Have a great day.